Hello and welcome to this talk on my latest book, Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And what I think makes this book slightly unusual is it doesn't tell the story of the abdication. It begins in 1936 with the abdication and the king moving into exile. And it tells the story really of what happened over the next 36 years until he died in 1972, and looks particularly at his marriage, and whether that was as idyllic as people have perhaps surmised, and also at the question of his loyalty to this country after 1936. I'm going to just go through a couple of slides just to give people a bit of background about both the Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. So first slide, please. This is a picture of Edward, born in 1894. Next. And Wallis, born in 1896. She came from a rather distinguished family in the States, but her father died when she was very young, and she was brought up in genteel poverty, which I think reflects perhaps or explains why in later life she was so keen on the finer things in life. Next. Here's the young prince in his garter robes, clearly destined to be trained as a king. Next. And this is Wallis as a young girl in Baltimore. Next. And this is how, in some ways, she escaped her home by marrying at the age of 19 a young air officer called Win Spencer. He turned out to be a bully and a drunk, and the marriage soon collapsed, and she ran away from him. And I think one can see in her various marriages an attempt for some sort of security after the problems she had with Win Spencer. Next. And here's the young Prince of Wales on one of his tours at the end of the First World War, sent out to thank the Empire for their contribution to the war effort, to help train him for his role as king, and I think also to take him away from all the married women in London that he was having affairs with. Next. And this is one of the women he was having an affair with, Frida Dudley Ward, married to a Liberal MP, a long relationship. In fact, he almost became like a father to her two daughters. But as soon as he met Wallis in 1931, he discarded Frida. He was not a person who was very good at dealing with situations like this. He just told the Buckingham Palace switchboard not to answer her calls. And that's how she learned about the end of their long relationship. He'd also been giving pearls to her daughters to make a necklace, and those stopped in 1931. Next. This is another woman he was involved with at the time, lots and lots of married women. Next. And this is Wallis's second marriage to a man called Andrew Simpson, a half-American ex-guards officer who'd been at Harvard, who worked for a shipping company. And indeed, one of the things that I found interesting researching the book was that she never really totally fell out of love with him. She continued to write to him after her marriage to the Duke. And I think she just wanted the attention of the Duke and wanted to be his mistress, but she'd never intended to marry him initially. Next. This is another of the people that she was very close to, von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador. There's some suggestion that he, in fact, was posted to London to help bring both Wallis and the Duke into the sort of pro-German circles. There are stories that he actually was Wallis's lover, and the 17 carnations he sent her each day reflected the number of times they slept together. Though in fact, given they hardly met, certainly less than 17 times, I think that story has to be apocryphal. Next. This was another of her lovers of the period, a man called Guy Trundle. This was revealed by MI5 surveillance of Wallis. The king was very concerned about the associates of the Prince of Wales, not just political, but also Wallis's circle. And the result of this surveillance was to discover that she was also two-timing the Prince of Wales. Next. And this is where they spent much of their time, certainly at weekends, Fort Belvedere, in Windsor, where he could relax, bring his friends, and treat it as his own sort of home. Otherwise, he had apartments in St. James's Palace. Next. And this is the funeral of his father, King George V, in January 1936, when he becomes king. His father had always thought that he would last less than a year, and he said ruin himself, and that's exactly what happened. He reigned for exactly 324 days. Next. This is a famous occasion in October 1936 when the whole romance becomes public, even though they've actually been together for the last 5 years. They go around the Adriatic on this boat, the Narlin, and it's reported on in the papers, and she actually appears to be very close to him in the pictures that are reproduced. Diana Cooper, who was on the trip, noted that even at this stage, Diana was not in love with him. She's actually bored by him and determined not to be left alone with him, always seeking to have some company with him. Next. And this is where the book begins. On December the 11th, 1936, the abdication crisis has taken place. He's been forced to choose between the crown and Wallis, and he's chosen Wallis. He's really been maneuvered into this position by Baldwin and the Dominions because they see him as a very unsuitable king, and she is a very unsuitable, even morganatic wife. And he decides that he will go into exile. He's going to await his absolute decree absolute, and then intends to marry her. Next. So that night he captures a ship across the channel called HMS Fury. It was going to be HMS Enchantress, but it thought wasn't the right sort of title for a ship to take him away. And he goes to stay with friends, the Rothschilds, just outside Vienna at this place called Windsors Field. Next. And he remains there more or less until he gets married in June 1937. And here is the party. First of all, Herman Rogers, a great friend of Wallis Simpson, who gave her away, the couple, and then the Duke's best man, a man called Fruity Metcalfe, who'd been his ADC. The Duke had been the best man to Lord Mountbatten, and he'd hoped that Mountbatten would also be his best man. But the decree went out from the royal family that no member was to attend the wedding. He was not to be supported in any way. The Church of England actually were not allowed to send any vicars to marry him. He was to be totally frozen out. Next. In fact, there was a Church of England vicar from Darlington who was prepared to marry them. You can see him there from the left-hand side, a man called Robert Jardine. You'll also recognize Winston Churchill's son, Randolph Churchill, on the far right, who was reporting the story as a journalist. And the wedding took place in a castle in the Loire owned by a man called Charles Beddoes. And Charles Beddoes turned out to be a very unfortunate choice. He was a Franco-American businessman. He made a lot of money from time and motion studies, but he was also very close to the Germans, and he was to prove to be an embarrassment in the Wallis and Edward's life. Next. And this is a picture of the Chateau de Condé, which you can visit to this day. Next. From Condé, they took their honeymoon in Austria. The Duke was very interested in Austria and Germany. He spoke fluent German. He was actually 14th, 16th German. And they had a long honeymoon here at Wassenberg. Next. And it was there again he reunited with Charles Beddoes. You can see him on the far right of this picture with his wife Fern. And Charles Beddoes said, "You've lost your throne, but there's still a role for you in the world. You're a great believer in peace. You never want the First World War to happen again. You want some sort of rapprochement with Germany. Why don't I organize a tour of Germany for you in October? You can go and see social conditions and housing, and you can make your case for a sort of world peace movement, and give the opportunity in some ways to give Wallis the sort of royal ritual that she's been denied." So that's what the Duke does. He doesn't tell anyone that he's going to Germany, and it's a huge embarrassment to the British government, and indeed it proves an embarrassment to him. Next. So he arrives in Berlin in October 1937. You can see here he's feted by the various Nazis. He has meetings with most of the Nazi leaders. He visits Goering at his house outside Berlin, and indeed even we'll see has a meeting with Hitler. Next. Some visiting SS troops. Next. Again, another of the visits. Next. This is him meeting Hitler for tea. Next. So it really turns out to be much more than a visit for social conditions. Beddoes is basically won some brownie points with the Germans for organizing this, and it's been a propaganda victory for the Nazis. They realize, the Windsors, that they're never really going to be allowed back to Britain in the near future. So they take the lease for 10 years of this large villa in the south of France near Antibes, now owned by Roman Abramovich, called La Croix, which you can see is pretty splendid. Next. And they also take a lease on a house in central Paris, and they divide their time between these two houses over the next few years. Next. This is the whole of the house in Paris. You can see just how extravagantly they live. They would have liveried staff, extensive staff, several chauffeurs, secretaries. There were 2 personal maids for Wallis. She had her sheets ironed twice a day. They really lived in the lap of luxury. And they were able to finance this because of a very good settlement that had been made at the time of the abdication by Bertie, and also by the fact that the Duke of Windsor had saved quite a lot of money from his time as Prince of Wales. Next. This again gives you a sense of the way that they live. This dining room, I think, only took 8 for dinner. They like to entertain generally about 24 in separate tables. On one occasion, a member of Wallis's staff said, "Only 6 for dinner tonight, ma'am." And she said, "Yes, but they are all kings." Next. The Duke is determined to try and do his bit for the war effort, and he volunteers to come back in September 1939. Here he is outside the War Office. And he's offered 2 jobs, as a regional commissioner in Wales and as a liaison officer to the French First Army. He decides on the Welsh job, and as a result is given the French job. So he returns to France, and his job is basically to go and inspect the lines of the French defences. Next. Which suits the British purposes because they haven't actually been allowed to see them. And he does several reports on them and reports back to the British. But also he reports his findings to Charles Beddoes, who passes them back to the German ambassador in The Hague, where he's often spending a lot of time at that time. And those defense plans eventually get themselves back to the Germans. So whether it was deliberate or not, the Duke was being extremely indiscreet, and there's great worry. There was worry even when he was king about his indiscretions and his lack of security. There's increasing worry now that war has been declared about not just partly his loyalties, but also his lack of security. Next. The Germans, of course, changed their plans. They sweep through France. They race on Paris. The Duke is forced to retreat, basically abandons his post and goes back to the south of France. And from there, he moves in a convoy to Spain and to Lisbon, where there are plans for him to be flown back to Britain. And while he waits, he stays in this house in Cascais, just outside Lisbon, which is owned by a man called Ricardo Espirito Santo, who turns out to be a German agent. Next. And here is Santo and his wife at the home in Cascais while they wait to be picked up. It's not an accident. The hotel where the Duke of Windsor is meant to be staying says it has no room there. It's actually influenced by the Germans, and they're sent off to Santo. And it's here that something called Operation Willie takes place, a plan to persuade the Duke to return to Britain as a sort of British Pétain figure, a go-lighter. And he's very flattered by this attention. He feels he's let down Wallis with his abdication. The war is not going well. Of course, we've seen the decimation of the British Expeditionary Force, retreat to Dunkirk. There are secret peace negotiations going on throughout this period through June and July 1940. And so it's not surprising the Germans feel that they might be able to reshape things. In fact, the retreat from Dunkirk means the British are able to fight another day, and the opportunity is lost. Next. But the man who's involved in this operation is a man called Walter Schellenberg, a young SS officer who's brought out to persuade him to come back. And if he won't come back immediately, if the situation doesn't allow it, to stay in touch, which is what the Duke does. Next. Churchill is very worried about this situation. At one point, he threatens the Duke with court-martial. He then, a plan is set up for him to go as Governor General, as the governor to the Bahamas to keep him out of harm's way. And here he is boarding the ship at Lisbon to go to the Bahamas with Walter Monckton, who's one of his advisors, behind him. But he's still in touch with the Germans, in fact, operating through code. And he says to them, even though the war hasn't been won by the Germans at this point, stay in touch with me. I'm perfectly prepared to come back to the Bahamas if the situation changes. Next. So he goes to the Bahamas. The government house has just been redecorated for him. Large sums of money being spent on it, but it's not good enough for him. He's worried about the decoration and threatens to basically leave his post, go off to his ranch in Canada, unless there is a further redecoration takes place. So for the price of a couple of Spitfires, and this is, remember, this is August, September 1940, at the height of the Battle of Britain and Britain under threat, money is being spent to buy some more furniture for the Duke of Windsor. Next. And this is what was bought. This is a picture of one of the rooms in Government House. Next. There they are in their finery. In some ways, Wallis rises to the occasion. She does a lot of charitable work. She's given a purpose in life. She, I think, has a pretty good war. She serves in the canteen for service people who are based on the island. She gets involved with various health clinics. The Duke is less involved. He actually is drinking quite heavily at this point. He's spending a lot of his time playing golf. He finds that he can make very little difference. He's caught between the Colonial Office and basically the sort of mafia who run the Bahamas, called the Bay Street Boys, who are local businessmen. And he rather gives up the situation. There's some rather poignant stories of him not even walking between holes in the golf course. He drives between them. He spends a lot of time swimming. And there's an extraordinary story where he takes a young officer, a man called Patrick Skene-Catling, who's still alive, to in the car to one of the townships, little black townships, where boys peel out of their houses and parade for him. And he gives basically a salute from his car while they drill for him with sticks. Next. The man that he becomes very close to at this point is probably the richest businessman in the Bahamas, called Harry Oakes, who's there as a tax exile. He goes, in fact, and lives in Harry Oakes's house when Government House has been redecorated. And it's there that one of the scandals of his time in the Bahamas takes place. Next. This is Westbourne House, where he lived. And it was there on the 8th of July, 1943, that one morning, Harry Oakes is found murdered in his bed. Next picture. And that's the scene. This is one of the great mysteries in Bahamas history. No one has ever been charged. Well, no one has ever been convicted of the murder. There are lots of theories who actually was responsible. The man who was charged and actually then acquitted was his son-in-law, a man called Alfred de Marigny. Next. And here he is going to his trial. But what's embarrassing for the Duke is that he has basically tried to frame de Marigny. He's basically arrested with very little evidence. In fact, there's planted fingerprint evidence that's used in the trial and then dismissed. The Duke has not called in Scotland Yard or indeed the police on the local RAF base or the local police even. He's gone to two FBI detectives in Miami to investigate the case, who turn out to have connections with the mob and to be highly corrupt. The suggestion is that the Duke is trying to cover up the Oakes murder. In fact, the chief of police, a man called Erskine Lindrop, is sent off on the Duke's instructions to Trinidad and taken away from the case. Next. The man who I think committed the murder and is suspected is this man called Harold Christie, later knighted, who was in basically business partnership with Oakes, but he was also in business partnership with the Duke. There was an attempt to take money out of the Bahamas and to invest it in Mexico, which was against wartime regulations. And I think the suggestion is that Oakes, Christie, the Duke, and one or two other figures were involved in this currency speculation and this attempt to take money out of the Bahamas. and that when Oakes, if there had been a proper investigation, this currency activity would have been discovered, and that's why it was covered up. There's also a suggestion that Oakes's money was then divided between Christie and the Duke and others, because it never, of course, been accounted for properly. Next. And this is another of the unfortunate friends of the Duke, Michael Axel Wenner-Gren, otherwise known as Goering's pal. He'd been involved in peace negotiations before, and indeed during the war. He was a Swedish industrialist who'd made his money from Electrolux, and he had a huge estate in the Bahamas. He became very friendly with the Duke, but there were great suspicions that the estate was being used for supplying, refueling U-boats in the Atlantic in very deep harbors, and that he was spying on the British and the Americans and their bases. And the Duke was repeatedly warned not to have anything to do with him, which he ignored. He actually would cruise on Wenner-Gren's yacht, the Southern Cross, which he bought from Howard Hughes. And again, it was part of the concern about the Duke of Windsor's activities. There was also concern that he would engage with the isolationists in the States and prevent America coming into the war, which was clearly something that the British wanted to avoid. Next. And here's the Duke in his office, always, of course, immaculately dressed. Next. And here they are on some of their charitable activities in the Bahamas. Here she is in her Red Cross uniform. Next. So at the end of the war, I think partly because of his embarrassing connections with people like Beddoe and Axel Wenner-Gren, partly because of the treachery that was suspected, the fact he had engaged with the Germans and had not always been completely straight with the British authorities, there was a determination that he really, one, wouldn't come back to Britain, that he wouldn't be given a job. He was very keen, for example, to have a role as some sort of roving ambassador in America. So these begin the years of the Wandering Windsors, where they just move from staying with various people between staying at the Waldorf Astoria in New York over the winter period, perhaps going to Florida at some point, going to their house in France, and generally sponging off people. It was really, for the next 20, 30 years, it was just going to parties and entertaining. Next. The people who, in some ways, are important figures in this story. First of all, this man here, Alan Lascelles, who was the King's private secretary. And next, this man called Guy Liddell, who was a counterintelligence officer in MI5. And they're important because they provide further evidence of the Duke's treachery. The end of the war in May 1945, the German Foreign Office files were discovered by accident by the Americans as the German armies retreated in May 1945. The documents should have been destroyed, but they weren't for various reasons, partly as an insurance policy for the person who wanted to barter his way to some sort of deal. And in these files, often known as the Marburg or Windsor files, is all the correspondence between the Duke of Windsor and the Germans through the 1930s, his involvement in sabotaging the involvement in the Anglo-German naval agreement, his attempt to minimize the impact of the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and his activities in May 1940 when he comes back to Britain and actually campaigns for some sort of negotiated peace, and then again his dealings with the Germans in the summer of 1940. And this is highly embarrassing. The Americans determined that these captured German war documents should be published. The British are determined that they should be suppressed. Churchill lobbies Eisenhower quite hard, and we have all the documentation for that. But the people who confirm it's true are Liddell in his diary and Lascelles in his diary. And this is, I think, part of the new information I have, which I think really nails the Duke's treachery. Next. There's also a very interesting episode at the end of the war when Anthony Blunt is sent to a castle called Kronberg to recover material on behalf of the royal family. Now, the cover story is that these were letters between Vicky, the daughter of Queen Victoria, and various people. But it seems a very odd special trip to make. Peter Wright, when he was interviewing Blunt, was told by the royal authorities that he should not mention this trip in Kronberg. It's not relevant to Blunt's treachery, and he doesn't. But it's become clear from the search I did that it's highly likely that what Blunt was sent to recover was correspondence between the Duke of Windsor and a man called Philip of Hesse, who was a cousin of his. And indeed, there are accounts of these letters at Kronberg at this time. So I think that was the real purpose of the trip. It was really why he, in some ways, was able to negotiate some sort of deal, immunity deal, with the authorities when he was found to be a Soviet agent. Next. This is another of scandalous episodes. The Duke and Duchess stay with their friend, the Earl of Dudley, in Berkshire, at this place, Ednam Lodge, in October 1946. And for some strange reason, they bring a lot of jewels with them. They don't put the jewels in the safe in the house. They go out for the evening. A cat burglar comes in through an open window and steals most of the jewels, and they're never recovered. The Windsors recover a huge sum on insurance, but there have always been questions about what happened here, that no one was ever again charged with the crime. But when the couple died and their effects were auctioned, it was discovered that many of the jewels that they had recovered, that they claimed on insurance in 1946, they actually still had, and they were sold in 1987. Next. This was another of the homes they took after the Second World War, again in one of the smarter arrondissements of France, and there they just would entertain aristocrats, various people, I mean, not really very distinguished people, sort of cafe society. Next. People here, they are, and you can see a number of film stars there, the Duke at the back, Daniel Zanuck, the filmmaker. I mean, it was always very glamorous. I mean, they would often cruise during the summer around the Mediterranean. There's a story of them visiting Rex Harrison, for example, in Portofino. They love mixing with the smart and glamorous. Next. And this is the house probably best associated with them in the Bois de Boulogne, which was leased to them at a very peppercorn rent by the French authorities, who were very good with the Duke. He never paid tax in France. He had this very cheap deal with them. He in effect became a tax exile and had all sorts of perks. And this was where many of the glittering parties that he held throughout the 60s took place. Next. And this is an extraordinary episode. We always imagined that Wallis, having married the Duke, sort of stuck with him faithfully. But the fact is that she had a series of affairs, most notably with this playboy called Jimmy Donahue, American playboy, who actually was gay. The wits quipped that she'd given up a king for a queen. And one of the attractions of Donahue was he was very rich. He picked up a lot of the bills. He was very entertaining. He made her feel young and special in a way that the Duke, who was actually rather boring, didn't. There's also some suggestion the Duke put up with this partly because Donahue picked up the bills, but also because he also was attracted to Donahue himself. Next. And here's some evidence of the affair between Donahue and Wallis from French Secret Service files. This is a surveillance report explaining how Donahue had come back one night late, stayed the night and left early the next morning. This, in fact, was at the time when the Duke had returned to London for the funeral of his mother, Queen Mary. Wallis, of course, was never allowed to accompany him. Next. And this, I think, is one of the rather pathetic pictures. They were dressed up in crowns and seated on the zebra-themed sofa at a nightclub, El Morocco, in the 1950s. This was a sort of joke of Jimmy Donahue's, who loved to humiliate them as the price for his generosity. Next. They are finally reunited with the royal family in 1957 when they come back for the dedication of a plaque to Queen Mary. And here you can see Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen, Queen Mother, Duke of Gloucester and his wife, and the Duke and his wife. And that was the first time that I think the Queen had met the Wallis and the Duke since 1936. But there was a feeling really by this stage that they couldn't be this royal rift, that it was bad PR for the royal family, and they really had to come to some sort form of accommodation, and that's really what happens after this. Next. I think the happiest times for the Windsors were their house outside Paris. This is called the Mill, where they would entertain people like Maria Callas and others at weekends, and where he could indulge his love of gardening. He recreated very much English-style gardens, and she was able to decorate the only home that they actually owned together. Next. And so here are some of the rooms, and not to everyone's taste, slightly garish colours, but they were happy with it. Next. That's pink and green always goes well, I think. Next. And here we come to 1972. Again, the rapprochement. The Queen is told that the Duke is dying, and she's on a state visit to Paris, and she pops in for tea. And I think this is when the situation begins to get a bit better. They realize that there needs to be some sort of contact between the two families. Next. The Duke died shortly after this. Though Wallis hasn't always been the most supportive wife, in fact, she bullied him. She'd often send him to bed in tears, called him a buzz-off mosquito, she would say. I think she was bereft when he died. She realized that he had given up so much for her, and that perhaps out of guilt, she felt guilty that she hadn't perhaps been a better wife. Here is a very striking image of her looking out from, I think, horse guards at the trooping of the colour as she returns for the funeral. Next. And this is part of the funeral. Both Mountbatten and Prince Philip are deputed to sit beside her at the lunch and to persuade her to return various papers that the Duke had, his garter robes and other things, to the Royal Archives, which she does. But there's great concern that those will find their way out of the royal family and could prove to be very embarrassing. Next. And at this stage, the Duchess, who is beginning to lose her marbles, is physically also very infirm, comes under the control of this woman called Suzanne Bloom, a French lawyer who basically controls everything to do with the Wallis in this period between 1972 and her own death in 1986. A lot of the furniture and paintings are either donated to institutions or are sold to pay bills. There's some suggestion they may have actually been filtered off to Matron Bloom and others. There's great concern about what is happening. The Duchess has got rid of Alan Overy, who previously represented her, it's a rather sad final few years. Next. The Duchess is largely confined to her room. She can hardly speak. She hardly weighs anything. She hardly eats. She just drinks vodka out of a silver tankard. In the spring of 1986, she dies. She is brought back for a funeral at St. George's, Windsor. And next, the couple are finally reunited, but she's never given the status that he had campaigned throughout his life for, of Her Royal Highness. So I think the two things I challenge in this book, one is the myth of the happy ever after, and the other is the loyalties of the Duke. I think he was far more actively engaged with the Germans when they approached him during the war. He was far more anti-Semitic, for example, and pro-German than I think people have realized. And so the glamour that surrounds the Windsors is perhaps slightly tarnished after my book. Anyway, I'm very happy to answer questions, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. So I'm just looking at the questions now. Was Queen Elizabeth aware of the Duke's treachery at the time of the rapprochement? Yes, I think the royal family were well aware, really, from certainly from the end of the Second World War. In fact, the King George VI is told about the treachery as he comes out from the balcony, having taken the crowds on VIII Day in an extraordinary way. So I'm sure the Queen was briefed, and it was one of the reasons why Churchill refused to have much to do with the Duke after the Second World War, because of his treachery. And the next question is, do you think it would be possible to run the same lifestyle today? And do I see some similarities between Andrew and Prince Harry today? I'm very happy to answer both those questions. I mean, it was extraordinary the extravagance with which the couple lived. I mean, they got stock tips from a lot of their rich friends. A lot of the time they sponged off other people, but they also had huge sums of money, partly from the settlement in 1937 from George VI, and also from monies saved when he was Prince of Wales. And there were literally millions of pounds slushing around. So they had very extensive staff, I say, all dressed in their own livery. And one of the ways that they were able to afford this was that they didn't pay them the going rate. It was a privilege to work for them. And they had all sorts of tax benefits that saved them money. Of course, lots of parallels, particularly between Harry and Meghan. The same situation of an American divorcee, a prince going into exile and giving up his royal duties, exploiting the royal brand for his own personal gain, the tensions between brothers who'd been close and also between their wives, the debates about security and finance, the attempt to curate the story with tame journalists and book writers, the suing of the press that they didn't understand, didn't like what they were writing, the blaming of the parents for bad parenting. One could go on. The parallels are enormous. And there is clearly something but in terms of self-entitlement between, I think, Andrew and the Duke of Windsor, what I call the rogue royals. They've inherited clearly these Hanoverian traits and can be quite oafish and perhaps not very sensitive to their role. There's always, of course, this tension in royal history between private pleasure and public duty. It's a trope, of course, that sustains the crown. And I think the problem is, in this case, and indeed with Andrew and perhaps with Harry, the private pleasure has taken over from the public duty. Another question is, was the so-called feud between the Queen Mother and Wallis exaggerated? Did they really use insulting nicknames when referring to each other? Well, absolutely. And I've just had a chance to get into the Royal Archives in the last few weeks. They were closed all the way through my research and COVID. And it's even bitterer than I realized. Wallis, of course, was called that woman by the Queen Mother. She couldn't even say her name. And Wallis called her the Witch of Glamis. But it was absolutely vicious. And of course, it was the Queen Mother who very much sustained Bertie in his opposition. And that's why he was kept away from Britain. He wasn't, I mean, no one, of course, supported him at his wedding. They were determined to just basically freeze him out and really didn't want to be associated with him at all. So a very, very sad situation, I think, and it'd be interesting to see if any of the lessons are learned this time around. I'm just looking at more questions as they come in. What do I think motivated his actions with the Germans? Well, that's a good question. I think he felt that he was flattered by their attentions. I mean, he did generally believe that he could bring about peace, which was, of course, a noble thing before 1939, but rather less noble once war had been declared. He'd always felt more German than British. Of course, the Germans were very good at making it, at flattering him, and of course, flattering Wallis, making them feel that they were important. In many ways, they'd given up a job and they were looking for some sort of purpose. And I mean, they could have found it through charitable works. They could have found it by being more active in the Bahamas. But I think they were felt that they had a role to play on the world stage. And those activities went on after the summer of 1940 with the isolationists. There was an attempt to basically persuade Roosevelt not to bring America into the war. And even after the war, he mixed with a lot of people who were very pro-Hitler and anti-Semitic. That was the company he enjoyed. And one of his best friends was Oswald Mosley. Someone has asked, did Wallis really learn her sexual wiles in Shanghai? Well, I don't know, because I don't really begin the book at that point. It's later. There was certainly a very strange sexual relationship between them. There's some suggestion they were both bisexual, but also that he was, shall we say, not very sexually developed, and that the only person who really could deal with him, whether it was through a foot fetish or through oral sex, was Wallis, with whatever she may have learnt in Shanghai. Several people saw the Shanghai report, including a man called Kenneth de Courcy, whose papers I looked at the Hoover Institute, and one of the Queen's advisors, a man called John Coke. So, John Cook. So I think there is evidence that there was a file that was collected on Wallis by the intelligence authorities, supposedly shown to Queen Mary to explain to her just what her son had got involved in. Someone's asked, did the Duke have sea active service in World War II? He didn't. I mean, he did go to the front, and in fact, he saw people, friends being blown up there. But because he was heir to the throne, he was kept away from active service. And I think he resented that. He never felt he could look at soldiers quite in the same way. But he was always very interested in the military. And I think his World War I experience certainly shaped his views post-war. Why was France so generous to him? Well, that's another good question. They, I think, saw they felt he was being badly treated by the British. It was perhaps a way of getting at the British. They liked having him in France, even though he didn't actually like the French. He never learned to speak French properly, and was often quite rude about them. But I think they just felt that there were some benefits for them to have him there, that he was a prestigious person. I mean, the previous person who'd had the house in the Bois de Boulogne was Charles de Gaulle. So he was in pretty distinguished company. Who funded the 1937 settlement? The royal family or the taxpayer via the government? Well, strictly speaking, he should have been funded through the civil list by the taxpayer. But when George VI discovered that the Duke had made so much money, saving his money from the civil list over the previous 20 years, he realized how embarrassing it would be if that came out. And so the royal family themselves paid the settlement, which was £25,000 a year, with £4,000 of that going to cover his share of pensions to members of the royal who'd served his father. But he had made lots and lots of money elsewhere. He also, of course, had his share in Balmoral and Sandringham, which he threatened to lease to American businessmen unless he was given quite a good settlement. And he made a lot of money from his investments and from other property sales. He was often given a lot of jewelry, or Wallis was given jewelry, and then they, of course, sold it later on. Why did the media not expose the Duke during his lifetime? Well, we had a much more deferential press, and indeed no one really has exposed the Duke until now, because they didn't do the research in the archives. The great thing about my book is it's based almost entirely on primary sources. So these are documents in the National Archives, correspondence with Churchill, papers now in American archives. There was some coverage of the relationship with Wallis in the American media, and then the story, of course, broke, but not for many of the British public until December 1936, when he was about to abdicate. And then even after the war, with the captured German documents, which was very embarrassing, that story was pretty much suppressed by the press proprietors. So the story really only came out in places like the States, and then was pretty limited. So it's really been a case of going back and just looking at the documents to get the real story. Someone has mentioned that the Duke gave a notorious broadcast in May 1939 calling for avoidance of war. Absolutely, he did this, of course, to overshadow his brother, who was on the tour of Canada, to try and make sure the Dominions were on side when war came. All part of upstaging his brother and trying to keep his profile up. So that was, again, deep embarrassment. He hadn't told anyone. He went to broadcast at Verdun. He did it through a friend of his called Fred Bates, NBC. In fact, the BBC didn't broadcast the broadcast to try and suppress it, but it was broadcast in the States, where it got quite a lot of attention, particularly from the isolationists, and a copy was put into Congress, and all sorts of people wrote to him. But the Duke remained in contact with Hitler even up to the outbreak of war, again through rather mixed motives. Could the British government have been more proactive in bringing the Duke in line before things got out of hand? Well, they were certainly monitoring him. I mean, he's the only monarch who's ever been bugged by MI5. The FBI were also keeping an eye on him. And he had police protection officers who were reporting on him at all times. Those reports can now be seen. And I think they were monitoring him. And of course, when it got to the very dangerous point in July 1940, when he was very actively engaged with the Germans and Schellenberg was there, that was when he was threatened with court-martial. And that's when he was basically sent off the Bahamas, at only a few moments, very short notice. So they did try and do their best when they were forced, their hand was forced. And Walter Monckton was always used by the government as the sort of middleman, someone that the Duke might listen to. So he was dispatched to Lisbon at this point. But it is always a difficult question. And after the war, though they froze him and didn't give him things to do, they clearly could have, he could have been brought to justice for breaking the Treachery Act, for example. He was communicating with the enemy during war and code, and that is a defense which he could well have been hanged for. Someone has asked how important was his experience of the First World War and his later views on Germany. Well, partly his First World War experience, the sense that this should never happen again. But I think he'd spent a lot of his youth on holiday in Germany, visiting German relations. He stayed very closely in touch with those German relations, like Philip of Hesse and Count Saxe-Coburg, Duke Saxe-Coburg. He saw himself as 14th, 16th German. His mother was a German princess. So, his sympathies in many ways had always been with Germans. He saw his role when he was king to try and create some sort of rapprochement, which is why he got involved when he shouldn't have done in the Anglo-German naval agreement, and why Saxe-Coburg was sent with the remilitarization of the Rhineland to persuade the king to basically soften the blow and to talk to ministers. Have I come under any pressure to turn things down? Well, certainly we've never had any comment from Buckingham Palace. The book has had some good reviews, particularly its first review in the TLS by Ian Wilson, who said that he bought my argument totally and has changed his view totally of the abdication and the Duke of Windsor. And we've had other good reviews in Spectator and the Mail. But most other papers have just not dealt with, have not reviewed it. And I'm not quite sure why. They've reviewed my previous books. Indeed, the Times and Sunday Times, who haven't reviewed it, fought over serial rights for my last book. So I don't know how far there's establishment pressure, but certainly there hasn't been as much coverage as I'd expected and would have liked. To what extent was their tour of Germany covered in the British press? It was covered a little bit, but not much. There are a lot of reports in the National Archives of diplomats and indeed even people in Germany, businessmen, reporting back on the tour. It was slightly farcical. Robert Lee, who was the man who escorted them around, was a drunk who drove far too fast. And Churchill's view at the end was that no one had taken it very seriously, but I think the Germans took it very seriously. They felt that they had, in a sense, a puppet leader there, which emboldened them in summer 1940. I think a lot of the stuff just wasn't reported because the press weren't there. A lot of these private meetings, dinners, there was no one there. So one of the interesting things about the visit was that very few records have been kept, and indeed, for example, the meeting with Hitler, the minutes for that have never been found. Why are these documents available now, i.e. the story no longer suppressed? Well, the documents have always been available, just no one's bothered looking at them. For example, the captured German documents were published in 1957. But I think people haven't joined the dots or haven't drawn the conclusions that I've drawn from the evidence. And of course, a lot of these materials are only released after 20 years after the event. Documents, for example, in the abdication were only released in 2002 after the Queen Mother died. And many of these documents have only been released because of freedom of information requests that I made, or because I found them not in the British archives, but in other archives. So for example, the archives in the Bahamas are mirror archives of the National Archives in terms of, for example, the Colonial Office files, but the files here have been heavily weeded and those in the Bahamas have not. So it's been possible to construct the story from sources outside Britain, for example, in America, private papers from people, letters, which wouldn't be possible from the official record here. Is there any evidence that Hitler promised to put Edward back on the throne if Germany won the war? Yes, this evidence is all in the Marlborough files, the Windsor files, these captured German documents. And it's there also in the correspondence between officials, Churchill writing to various government officials and members of the royal household. And these files have now become available. Not all of them, some are still kept back, but enough to show exactly what was going on. And what if Hitler had won? Would Edward likely have replaced his brother? Well, it's one of the great what ifs of history. But there's some suggestion that Churchill would, I'm going to wrap up now in the last 2-3 minutes, but there is some suggestion that the Churchill and George VI may have been forced to flee or would have been imprisoned. Someone like Lord George would have taken the role of Prime Minister, and Edward would have been the puppet king. And just one last question, given that Wallis was from a good family, private schooling, did it make for a better story for the press and the royal family to ignore this and portray her as a gauche American? Yes, I think that's right. She, was a very sophisticated woman, but of course she'd been brought up in poverty. She was someone who was pretty ruthless and very ambitious, and of course, so I wouldn't say she was always portrayed as gauche, but she was portrayed in a very negative way. What I'd like to say is there are lots more questions and we've run out of time, but if you Google my name, you'll find my agency website, on my own website. I'm very happy to take questions, emails through that source. And I'm just sorry that we didn't have more time to cover some of the fascinating questions that you've raised.